Life has better plans for you than you have for life. I think that's the main thing. So when I was 48, I wasn't thinking about the clock ticking in the same way. Is to see what you have chosen to give your life to in your 60s. So it's not the place where we happen to live. It's what lives inside us.
Welcome to the Midlife Chrysalis podcast with Chip Conley, where we explore how midlife isn't a crisis, but a chrysalis, a time of profound transformation that can lead to the most meaningful chapter of your life.
Welcome to the Midlife Chrysalis. I'm Chip Conley, and I was so excited to connect with my good friend, Pico Iyer again. I consider him to be one of the wisest people in the world. He's certainly worldly, and he'll tell you his story about how he's lived around the world, and he's one of the best known travel writers. He's actually given more TED Talks in the last dozen years than anybody else in the world. He's a bit of my modern elder. I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. It was wide-reaching, including the fact that he has been close friends with the Dalai Lama for more than a half century. I hope you enjoy it. This is a guy that I have known for a long time, somebody I really admired from afar, somebody who we had a lot of common interests: travel, meditation and stillness, the definition of home. And he's probably one of the most hospitable people I've ever met. And I'm speaking about you in the third party right now. But Pico, you're just an incredibly lovable human. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Chip. I'm just so delighted at the friendship that we formed, and may it continue forever.
Yeah, agreed completely. And Hiroko, your wife, is just as much of a delight. So let's start with the fact. Let's give you some credit here. I did some research, and there is no one who has given more TED Talks in the last dozen years than you. You've given 5 TED Talks. So why do you think TED likes you so much?
Better the devil you know than the devil you don't know. You know, they know the known quantity they're working with me and all the many difficulties I present to them. But I've been really grateful to them because, as you know, I'm a writer spending most of my life in my desk in the middle of nowhere, Japan. So TED has really helped me come out into the larger world. So I'm very glad of the global megaphone they've given me. And I know you've given at least 3 talks. So we share that again.
And which of these 5 talks is the one that is most close to your heart as of today?
I think almost inevitably the first one, which was about what is home, really. And just the fact that you're a perfect example that more and more of us have more and more homes. And I think that's a great blessing. You and I have never spoken about this, but there's so much despair and anxiety in the world. And because I'm 68, when I look back at the world I grew up in, I think our universe has advanced in so many ways and has got richer and more interesting and more long-lived. And so that's one of them. You know, I remember when I was at high school, 1,250 boys in our school, only boys. There were 3 of us with dark skin.
And where was this?
This was in England, near London. And even Catholic and Jewish boys were so unusual that there were only, I think, 12 of them in the entire school. So 1,235 boys, all from the same small segment of society. Now, when I go back to that high school, every other kid is from China or Russia or Nigeria or some blend of the two. And of course, that's true of every classroom in major cities. So I'm really grateful that the world has expanded so much.
Tell us a little bit more about your upbringing and also your evolving perspective on home.
Yeah, thank you. So I was born in England to parents from India. And then when I was 7, we moved here to Santa Barbara, California, where I'm sitting. And so I remember I was so excited. I felt I had 3 pairs of eyes, 3 ways of seeing the world. And I could mix them and match them and see England with Californian eyes or California with Indian eyes. And as I was saying, in those days, it was so unusual. I never imagined that it would almost be the norm. I think if you go to any classroom tomorrow, the kids you meet will be more multicultural and international than I am. And then maybe the other thing I should say, because you did mention travel, is that in those days, such was the exchange rate, I worked out it was cheaper to continue going to my old school in England, which was a day school and a boarding school, than to go to the school down the road here in Santa Barbara. And so from the time I was 9, I was flying by myself over Greenland 6 times a year, going to school and flying back to see my parents. And so got used to living in planes and mixing cultures and being kind of living in the passageway between cultures.
And so what does home mean to you, though, in terms of just the evolution of home? And in an era in which we have such a migrant population, what do you see as the perspective on home that is a modern perspective that might not have been true 50 or 70 years ago?
Yeah, that's perfectly said. And I think more and more of us feel that home is not a piece of soil. It's really a piece of our soul. It's a collage and a work in progress made up of the many different influences from everywhere that make us who we are. So I think home, I always felt, is not the place where we happen to live. It's what lives inside us. And as you know, because you've heard me talk about this before, my house, where I'm sitting now, burnt to the ground. I lost everything in the world. But the next day, I realized I'd lost a house, but I hadn't lost a home. Because my home was internal, and because I think of my home as my wife-to-be, Hiroko, whom you mentioned, and my mother, and my words and my memories, and maybe most of all, my sense of purpose, none of that had been taken away by the fire. And I think what excites me is that people much younger than I have a much richer sense of home, almost like this stained glass pattern to which they're constantly adding new elements. And just as you say, that was not possible 70 years ago. When my grandparents were born, all 4 of them were born in India. And I think almost when they were born, they were given these little cards saying, this is your tribe, this is your caste, this is your religion, these are your friends over here, those are your enemies on the other side of the street, and you'll be locked inside that framework your entire life. And now you and I and so many of the people we know are free of that and free to create our own home. And it's always a challenge because you can end up feeling neither here nor there and kind of falling between the cracks like the gratings on the sidewalk. But I think by and large, it's much better to have too much choice than too little. And I think we're the beneficiaries of that.
With the idea of home being inside of yourself, maybe a soulful place that you can reside in no matter where you are in the world. This sort of builds a bridge to your work on stillness, your beautiful book on stillness, your TED Talk on it, and just what I've heard you say. So could you just tell us a little bit about your point of view on stillness? And in particular, this podcast is called the Midlife Chrysalis for a reason. The idea that in midlife, it may not be a crisis, but it may be a gooey, dark, and solitary time that you're going through some kind of circumstance, whether it's external or even internal, that requires a transformation. Talk a little bit about how stillness can foster that kind of transformation. And maybe just talk about maybe your own point of view on how you went through a midlife chrysalis and the fact that going inside helped you to get through it.
Yes, be prepared for a 6-hour-long answer.
That's okay. Okay.
I was saying before that I grew up in planes, going back and forth all the time. And so I think drawing upon that background, my first half of life, I was constantly traveling the world. I was going from Tibet to North Korea, from Yemen to Easter Island, and just thinking I belong to the first generation in human history that has the chance, if you can save up the time and resources, to go to those places. And I think at the second half of life, I began to think that stillness was the only way you could take everything you've seen in travel and convert it into meaning or convert it into vision. That travel is a wonderful way of stimulating yourself, but the only way of really turning it into a vision for life was by sitting still. I find, it's very hard to be moved when you're racing from place to place. And so, just as you say, I think I began spending more and more time being still. And I think I said to you once before that travel to me is like going to the farmer's market and collecting vegetables and herbs and spices. But stillness is how you turn them all into a meal. And then to speak really to the other part of your question, again, you may know that I began my midlife crisis really early, or my midlife transition very early, ahead of the curve, because when I was 29, I was really leading the life I might have dreamed of as a little boy. I had this wonderful office in Midtown Manhattan, an apartment on Park Avenue, and this job of writing world affairs for Time magazine. So in some ways, it was everything I might have hoped for. And I was having a great time. But I realized that happiness is not the same as fulfillment. And I was thinking, I'm having such a good time. Maybe I'm excluding the possibilities of a deeper or better time. And since I was in my 20s, I didn't have dependents, I didn't have responsibilities. I threw all that over and moved to a single room along the eastern hills in Kyoto, Japan, where I didn't have a bed, didn't have a phone, didn't have a toilet of my own. But I thought the foreign is going to teach me much more than the familiar. And I also thought when I got to Japan, I was stripped of my resume and I was stripped of my words. I still can't speak much Japanese. So I thought I'm going to have to learn to listen. I'm going to have to learn to observe. And I'm also going to have to learn to be part of a community and to be invisible, which is something I'd never really learned before in England or the US. So I'm glad I did that. I think something in me thought, I'm having such a great time in this job. I could easily wake up and find I'm 70 and realize I'm about to die and I've never really lived. I've never explored other alternatives. So when you're 20, in your 20s, it's not hard to try something different. And in a curious way, 3.5 years after I moved to Japan, I lost everything in the world when this family home burnt to the ground. And I realized that there was probably some kind of reason that I'd chosen to lead a simpler life, because then I had to lead a simple life. I didn't have any possessions anymore. So there was a great shock to lose everything in the world. But at some level, I suppose I'd been preparing it for it, or life had been preparing me for it. And in retrospect, I was glad that I'd moved to a much quieter life. And then I know just what you mean about how I think in the middle of the life, all of us feel like Dante. We're waking up in a dark forest and we've lost our way. And our youthful dreams are exhausted, but we haven't yet reached the kind of wisdom and the ripened state of older age. And so we're caught in this kind of limbo. And I'm sure I went through that in my late 40s or when I was 50, not in a dramatic way like you, but probably wondering, I don't seem to have a future and I don't seem to have a past. What am I going to do now? But I was glad that in some ways I'd sort of made things possible for myself at an earlier stage by moving to Japan.
Gosh, there's two things I want to talk about, but let's start first with moving to Japan. Why Kyoto? What was it about, going from Park Avenue to Kyoto? And this is way before the digital nomad thing started to become a thing. This is actually, frankly, before digital. What was it about Kyoto and specifically Japan and specifically Kyoto that attracted you, and also, to move into the simplest of lifestyle?
So I could give you lots of answers, but I wouldn't believe them. In other words, I think it's just kind of intuition. I don't know if I've ever told you, but while I was living in New York, I once had a 20-hour layover at Narita Airport near Tokyo, which I didn't want, but I was on my way back from Hong Kong to JFK. And I walked around that little airport town and I felt such a sense of familiarity that I realized if I didn't spend more time in Japan, I would be an exile all my life. It's like when you meet somebody and you feel that person is your oldest friend, though you've never met him or her before. And so I was glad of that intuition. And later when I thought of it, maybe the fact that Kyoto is a very quiet and contemplative place seemed like the ideal complement to New York City. I certainly knew that whatever happened or didn't happen when I moved, just going to the grocery store would be an adventure. And also being freed of distractions, every day would last 1,000 hours. And although I didn't last in that single room for very long, as you probably know, I now live with Hiroko in a 2-room apartment, not so far from where I first moved.
And how much do you pay in rent a month?
I know, $500 a month. We're living as if we were 21 years old still and loving it. I mean, not missing anything. I think when I was living in New York, I could feel I was missing something. And I was caught up in this, all the world that you know, very, very fast driving, exciting world. But something was not being satisfied. And now I never feel that I'm missing anything and never regret that move. So I think in a curious way, Kyoto did seem the perfect place for a more inward-looking life and kind of preparation for the second half of life. And I know when I spoke to you a few weeks ago, it suddenly struck me that when I chose Japan of all the other places I could go from New York City, I was choosing a grandmother culture. I was choosing an elder and a wise, seasoned place that had been through 1,600 years of wars and plagues and turbulence and knew how to deal with it. And so I sort of went as a student wanting to learn from Japan the things I could never have learned in England and the US. And it's never let me down, really. I mean, I know you know Japan very well, and you know how it's like another planet. It's more alien than anywhere I know, but to me, that's a blessing in so many ways.
There's a lot of value in being an expat,
Yes.
especially in midlife and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that for a moment in terms of, as advice to those who are listening about why there's value in that. I have found that in Baja because it means you're a beginner again. Maybe you're picking up the language. You're learning about another culture. You're having to be the other, but I'd love to hear your thoughts and your suggestion about whether it's a good idea for someone to pick up and leave and be an expat for a little while.
I love that question. And I know you learned to surf, I think, by being in Baja, even though you're a Californian. So I think it's definitely a good idea. I was going to say a variation of what you just said, which is everything is new, everything is strange. You're brought back to a child's sense of wonder, beginner's mind, as you say. You're humbled. You're not the center of the world. You're kind of servant of the universe rather than a master of the universe. It helps you to understand your home better. I think living in Japan and talking to Japanese people has made me appreciate what's wonderful about America, which is still a youthful, fresh world of opportunity that they don't have in older cultures. But it's also made me see what the United States doesn't have that Japan does, such as experience and a sense of limits and a kind of realism. And of course, just in a practical sense, you can live much more cheaply. I meet a lot of young people who want to be writers, and as you know, it's very hard to make that work economically these days. And I tell them, go to Prague, go to Buenos Aires, go to Hanoi. You can easily live probably for $500 rent a month there. You're surrounded by fascinating things. There's never a shortage of material. And that's the place where you'll probably have the time and space and material to write your first book and to become a different person. So I'm a great believer, I think, in expatriation.
Yeah. And for an older person who's going into retirement and has worries about, do I have enough money if I'm going to live longer than I thought I was going to live? An expat lifestyle can be very helpful for that as well.
Yes. I mean, and so many people travel now for medical tourism because they know that they'll get much better care in Thailand or Mexico than they would in the US and for a tenth the price with US trained doctors. And I think you're probably in the same state. So many of my friends recently, they're a little unsettled by the US right now. So they're moving to Panama and Mexico and Argentina, so many other places.
So back to Stillness for a moment. Portugal for sure. Portugal has become very popular. The idea of stillness in midlife and the idea of finding that home to weather the storm. We're going to be co-leading a workshop this summer, later this summer, in late August at our Santa Fe campus. Talk about that, how that stillness can be helpful when you're dealing with a world that feels in disarray and chaotic. And maybe just a little bit more content around like what is that the workshop going to focus on?
It's going to focus entirely on how we find calm in a world of mounting uncertainty and how we stay hopeful in the midst of impermanence. And as you know, earlier this year, I brought out a book called Aflame about how the whole world is on fire, literally, because there are more and more wildfires, but metaphorically, because even if you're not worried about wildfires, turbulent politics, runaway technologies, wars, earthquakes, hurricanes, flash floods, all of it. I've never seen my friends so despairing and so anxious as right now. And I think what we're craving is the ability to stay clear and grounded and confident in the midst of these swirling winds. And so at our workshop, I think I'm going to be drawing from certain examples. The Dalai Lama, I've spent a lot of time with, the Benedictine monks of Big Sur, whom you know also, Japan, which is very good. Even through the pandemic, it remained unruffled. And also just inviting everyone through prompts to think about where they have felt truest and deepest and most unfazed by the world around us. Because I think the other two things that we're all facing is that our nation and our world are more divided than ever, and that there's greater distraction. Just 2 years ago, the Department of Labor sent out a survey, and 79% of people who responded said they never had a minute to rest or to think. And so if we're thoughtless and if we're stressed out, we're never going to make the right decisions. And I think also aligned with that, you've spent a lot of time around Silicon Valley. I think we all know that technology has made our lives longer and healthier and richer, some ways happier. But the one thing it hasn't given us is a sense of how to make wise and discerning use of technology, how to make sure we're not the servant of our machines, but we're in balance with them. And again, that's the kind of thing you can only do by sitting still. And you've heard me talk before about how the inner savings account and how I try to think about how all of us are going to face terrible challenges in our life. Reality is going to make a house call more than once. And what do we have to bring to it? And I think it's at those moments when suddenly you lose a loved one or you lose a job or the market is turbulent, you realize that your resume isn't really going to help you. And the achievements you've done in the world aren't much help. And even your bank account is only of limited use. So the only thing you have to draw on is your inner savings account. And I think we build that up not by running around, but by sitting still. That's the only way we gather inner resources. 700 years ago, Meister Eckhart, the wise German philosopher, said, as long as the inner work is strong, the outer will never be puny. Your career, your relationships, they'll all take care of themselves. But if your inner landscape isn't strong, you'll be like a car without an engine. And so maybe that's the reason why also I moved to Kyoto, because I thought I've got to take care of my inner resources as well as all the external stimulations. So one of the reasons I've been writing about silence is that I think words and beliefs cut us in two and divide us, and silence brings us together. So if you and I were to talk for 3 hours about things we really care about, we share so much, but we'd probably be at odds in certain ways. But if we share a moment of silence, I think we're brought to our deepest self, where we're absolutely united, and we're united with everyone around us. That's why moments of silence are so powerful in a church or even in a crowd.
So what are some practical tips? Let's acknowledge that I think you've done a pilgrimage to the new
Yes.
Hermitage south of Esalen Institute in Big Sur, maybe 100 times.
Correct. Yes.
A wonderful place for silence and retreat and writing, and basically a great place to have a simple life for a short time. So you do that as one of your practices. How about people who don't have the ability to go and spend a week there or 100 times, but they're looking for something that's closer to home? Something, do you have any recommendations? I'm going to talk a little bit of. Let me tell you a couple of mine. I have two that work for me. Now I love meditating, and that's something I try to do if I can every day. Not a long meditation, but just a short one. But the two things that actually I sustain myself with as almost a ritual, and the difference between a ritual and a routine is, in a ritual, you're willing to be altered, is I try to have a Sabbath. I try to have a day on the weekend, it's usually Sunday, in which I am offline most of the day. Rarely the whole day, but most of the day I go offline and I go hike. And if I'm in Baja, I'm hiking with my dog Jamie or my partner Oren. But usually I'm doing this alone. And in Santa Fe, it's usually alone. And it's we've got 2,566 acres here on the ranch, so I can literally do a half marathon 4-hour hike on the ranch, 13 plus miles, and just look at nature and ask nature as I go on the hike, nature, what do you have? What can you teach me today? I call it spying on the divine. So that's one thing I do. And I try to do that each week if I can, because I know as I've gotten a little older, I've gotten a little more introverted, and I know that I need that fuel. The second thing I do every single day, and this is without, I do it, and it's not a routine, it does feel like a ritual, is I stack a habit. in the morning when I'm taking a shower. I just did it a few minutes ago. And the habit is I say 3 prayers and 6 mantras in the shower each morning. Same 3 prayers. One of them is the Serenity Prayer. The second one is the St. Francis Prayer. The third one is the 7th step prayer in, the 12-step program. And then 6 mantras that are quite specific to me. And I say the 6 mantras 3 times each. So while I'm doing a shower, so it's 5 or 7 minutes in the shower. So an example of a mantra would be, I'm lovable for who I am, not what I do. And I'll say that 3 times. And there's 6 of those I do. So that's a way to center myself going into the day and create this sense of, in the case of my weekend Sabbath, space and stillness. Maybe I'm doing activity. I might be, walking, but there is stillness. And in the shower, it is a way to just sort of center myself and ground myself for the day. So what are some thoughts and practices you have?
Well, I love that. And to no surprise, nobody's surprise, you said exactly the things I was going to say. I mean, we're really, really aligned on this. The first thing I was going to say was take a walk. And the second thing I was going to say was, some people, including myself, find meditation a little intimidating. But if you do, you can still sit for 20 minutes every morning without your devices, clearing your head, filling your head, preparing yourself for the tumult to come. 20 minutes is only 3% of your day, but it completely transforms perhaps the other 97%. I love your notion of an internet Sabbath, and it's even more moving because you're the fastest email respondent I know, and I'm pretty quick too, but nonetheless, we can both afford to be slower, at least one day a week. None of our friends is going to be thrown out, especially because they know that we tend to respond very fast. And as you know, so many people in Silicon Valley realize that they have to go offline for maybe 24 hours every weekend so that they have something fresh and creative to offer when they go online again on Monday mornings. I also, as you know, am a firm believer, because I've been in the news business for 43 years, of not following the news. Limiting yourself to 5 minutes a day for the news, because there's usually about 2 minutes worth. And turning to the beauty around you, just as you were saying, and to the practical ways you can help the people around you, which I never get from the news. The news makes me feel usually hopeless and powerless. And looking around me on a bright summer morning in California fills me with hope and possibility. And that probably, it's interesting because I'm lucky to travel with the Dalai Lama once. I was once having a long dinner with his brother, his younger brother, who's also a Rinpoche, an incarnate Lama, quite a high teacher. And he said exactly what you said, Chip. He said, you take a shower every day and you're spending 10, 15 minutes there. Why don't you use it for some good? Instead of just idly singing your latest Bruce Springsteen song or whatever, why don't you use it as a time to set a tone for the day, which is just what you do? And I've found that the older I get, the more I devote my shower time. Not exactly the same to you, but to gratitude, certainly. I don't take things for granted the way I did when I was a kid. And I'm so glad at 68, I and my wife are relatively healthy and can do most of the things that we love. And so I always say that. I pan around the places that have given me hope and feel like protectors to me, much the same way as you do. I love the Serenity Prayer. I really think the older I get, almost all the wisdom we need is right in that. And the beauty of it is it doesn't ask you to subscribe to any belief system or religion. It's just a truth of life that people have discovered. And then I think this is a variation on what you're saying. It came home to me in the pandemic. Am I going to think about all the things I'm missing and can't do? Or am I going to think about all the things I do have and that I can do every day? So will I turn myself towards gratitude or frustration? And of course, the more gratitude I activate in myself, the happier everyone around me is and the happier I am too. So I think you and I are just perfectly aligned. I don't really think of anything that you didn't mention. I wish I had learned to surf, but you're way ahead of me on that.
You have been traveling with and spending time with the Dalai Lama for maybe 30 years. I don't know how long.
51. Yeah, a long time since I was a teenager. Yeah.
Well, give us the origin story of how you became good friends with the Dalai Lama in your teens and have had a half century with him. And what have you learned from him? What are some evolutions, and how have you seen him evolve over time? Did he have a midlife crisis?
Well, let's start there. No, I think he prepared himself for a midlife crisis when he was 4 years old. He became a monk at the age of 4, and he became ruler of his people on the lion throne in Lhasa at the age of 4. And he did go through 20 years of really rigorous education to get the equivalent of a doctorate. And people don't always remember he got a doctorate in logic. And so I think that's what he has used, because he certainly has suffered as much as anyone I know. But I don't think he's faltered. And I don't think he ever had a midlife crisis. And I can talk more about that. But to go back to the origin story, I was just lucky. I inherited this connection because my father was a philosopher and knew a lot about Buddhism. And so when the Dalai Lama came out of Tibet in 1959, my father was one of the few people who realized for the first time in history, this great treasure house of wisdom was available to the world. So he sailed all the way back from England, where we were living, to India and requested an audience with the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama, newly arrived in the outside world, was really keen to talk to everyone and to learn from anyone he could. And so my father was one of the first people to meet him in 1960. And the Dalai Lama has a remarkable memory, so he never forgot that. And so my father took me up to meet the Dalai Lama in his home in northern India when I was a teenager. And of course, I couldn't follow what they were saying, but we all know that Dalai Lama has a certain charisma and presence and a gift for making everyone in his room feel as if you're meeting your oldest friend. And that transmitted itself to me. 5 years after that, he began coming to the United States for the first time. And he came to Boston, which is where I happened to be living. And then it's hard to believe nowadays that in the early 1980s, nobody really knew who or what the Dalai Lama was. He sounded like a figure out of legend, or like the abominable snowman, or some kind of mythic person. So I remember in the early 1980s, he would come to New York City, where I was living, and he'd hold a press conference. There'd be 5 people, 4 Tibetans and me. I remember in 1984, because I was working at Time magazine, I set up a lunch for him to meet my editors, because I knew that they would enjoy meeting him, and I realized it would help him tell the story of Tibet. Literally an hour before that lunch, one of my bosses called me up and said, "Oh, blow this guy off. Just cancel the lunch. We don't want to come in on a Monday morning to see a monk." And of course, 5 years later, after he won the Nobel, the same editors were flying across the world just for 10 minutes with him. But I was lucky to know him before the world discovered him. And lucky, too, that he always remembered those early meetings. And then recently, he came to Japan for 10 straight Novembers. And every time he came, my wife and I were by his side for every minute of his working day. So we'd go shopping in a busy Yokohama mall for eyeglasses with him, or share cans of hot tea in a convenience store as we were driving across Japan. So the remarkable thing is, to answer whether he's changed, when I go back and read an article that my father wrote in 1960, when the Dalai Lama was 25, everything he says then is what he would say tomorrow. He is so strong in his principles that he knows where he stands, and he's never deviated from that. What he's so good at is reading the news. And as you may know, every day when he's doing his first 4 hours of meditation, he listens to the BBC World Service. So he knows more about the news than I do as a journalist. And so although his principles are rock solid, he's always adapting them to what's happening in Ukraine or Gaza or Washington, wherever. He's really up to the minute. I think one of the things I've learned most from him, which really speaks to the MEA and the second half of life, is to be very realistic in your expectations. Otherwise, you're just writing a prescription for disappointment. Because when I travel with him, hour after hour, every 10 minutes, somebody comes up to him and says, "Your Holiness, my son just died," or "A hurricane just wiped out our town," or "I just lost my job," or "I've really worked hard to reverse the climate crisis and it hasn't worked." And the Dalai Lama always looks at that person with great warmth and kindness, like a godfather or an uncle, and says, "Wrong dream. You have to be very precise in assessing your dreams, and you have to make them plausible and doable. You're not going to be able to bring peace to the Middle East tomorrow. People have been trying that for hundreds of years. What you can do maybe is try to bring the competing parties into the same room and try to set a foundation for discussion. But don't expect quick results." It's interesting, when he gives lectures around the world, quite often somebody will put up a hand and say, "Your Holiness, how do you find enlightenment? And tears will come to his eyes. And he will say, if I, as the Dalai Lama, live 10,000 lives, I may come within sight of what enlightenment means. No shortcuts in life and no quick answers. And, work with what you have and don't set your expectations unreasonably high. I think another thing that's very touched me, which speaks to so much of what you're thinking about, working with the difference between a resume and a eulogy, say. And I apologize if I've told you this before, but I once went to see him for a series of discussions in 1996 at his home. Every afternoon we'd meet for 3 hours and talk about various things. And that time, he'd won the Nobel Prize. There were 2 big Hollywood movies coming out about him. He was on every other magazine cover. He was probably the most beloved and respected person on the planet. And so I asked him, what's your greatest achievement? And to my surprise, he remembered that once he'd been visiting South Africa and he was in Johannesburg, and he asked to go to meet a typical family in the township of Soweto. And so he went in and he talked to a group of Black South Africans. And he met somebody, and the guy said, I just have no hope. I live under the system of apartheid. I've never voted. I'm not able to get education. I can't get a good job. There were no possibilities available to me in life. And the Dalai Lama talked to him for an hour. And he, the Dalai Lama, felt at the end of that hour, suddenly that man had a sense of hope and confidence. And so the Dalai Lama said to me, that's my achievement, just one person. And I think it's helped me a lot in my life and in my practices, because I sometimes think, as you were saying, you and I can give a TED talk, 3 million people will listen to it. But I think often the way we touch and affect people more is you're so good about responding to emails, and I try to be too. And if some reader writes to me and says, I read something from your book or I saw a TED talk and it helped me, to respond with all your heart probably is going to be something that will stay with that person for life. And that maybe affecting that one person's life is at least as useful as delivering a talk that goes out to 2 million people. And maybe that's an example too of realistic expectations. I was thinking just this morning, waking up very early, I write books and that's what I do for a living, but books very quickly get forgotten. But acts of kindness don't. And that's why I think just speaking from the heart and trying to interact with people just on a one-to-one basis is perhaps one of the greatest contributions we can make. And if even the Dalai Lama feels that, then probably the rest of us surely could.
You just reminded me why I created MEA.
Yeah.
because of those, those ripples of impact, not the ROI of return on investment, but the ripples of impact, another form of ROI. Yeah, thank you. That was beautiful. So, as we get older, I've said that we become alchemists. We learn how to take the polarities of introvert and extrovert, masculine and feminine, curious and wise, gravitas and levity. And I look at your life, Pico, and I see this is a man who has been alchemizing his polarities a long time. New York, Kyoto,
yes.
home, travel, savoring, seeking. There's sometimes a tension between these polarities, and part of maybe wisdom and part of learning how to live a good life is knowing how to take those opposites and fuse them into something that's quite beautiful, as the alchemy of these opposites. What does that mean to you in terms of how you've lived your life? The idea of just, even seeking and savoring, which I do think is that, to me, that is an interesting dichotomy of, I see you as a seeker and as someone who savors. Being a speaker, an amazing speaker, and being silent. So what do you think about the idea of we're alchemists as we age?
I love that. And I've never thought of seeking and savoring together. And it's a beautiful way to put it. And I think, as you say, we're all seeking a balance. And I think it's almost like breathing in and breathing out. We all need to be in the world. That's how we offer something to the world. But we all need to be quiet to gather the resources that we share with the people that we meet. I am a seeker, but I never expect to find anything. And I think I sometimes hope to be found by something, but I know that it's folly to go to lasso and expect that suddenly revelation is going to come to me. And I think one of the things I've gained from growing older, and you write about it in so many of your recent books, is not expecting answers and being happy to live in the absence of answers, and actually being grateful for asking deeper questions rather than answers. And I was very moved when I heard that Pope Francis, when he prayed, and he was living in a very difficult situation, didn't pray for answers. He prayed for the calm to live with the absence of answers, to live with answerlessness, which is where most of us are. And I think when I was a kid, I really wanted to know everything, and I wanted to be on top of everything. And now I'm really grateful to be at the bottom of everything, as it were, to be humbled by life and not to know. And I find that the things that I don't know are really what inspire me. Why do we fall in love? Why did I move to Japan? Why does a forest fire suddenly burn down our life? I couldn't claim to explain those, nor do I want or need to. And so I think living calmly with the absence of answers has been a great blessing for me. And maybe that has something to do with living calmly with what seems to be contradictions. Because it's true, I think some people looking at my life, traveling a lot and then spending weeks on end with the Benedictine monks not going anywhere, would say, you're just moving from one extreme to the other. But I suppose by exploring both extremes, that's a way better to come to the middle road, as the Dalai Lama would say. In other words, a way of balancing and drawing from each of those. Maybe the way that, when I was a kid, I was going back and forth between England and California. And I always felt that England was the land of the past, but didn't have much hope. And California was the land of the future, but didn't have much of a sense of history. And if our life is about bringing hope and history together, in the sense that we've all had sorrows and wounds, but we can't live without hope. Even in those days, I was mixing together these two radically different worlds and thinking, what a blessing to be able to be a part of both of them and to learn very opposite lessons. And probably the same with New York and Kyoto. I learned so many wonderful things in New York, and they were certain to be different from the things that I learned in Kyoto, and therefore Kyoto seemed like a good companion. But I like that notion of living in contradictions. I think one of the wisest speakers on religion I know, who's a student of your friend Richard Rohr, is Bono. And I remember Bono said at once, that's what life is about, living at the center of a contradiction, because everyone asks him that same question. And he's thrived on being an extrovert who's drawing from his moments of prayer, and on being a musician who's still ready to brave trying to save the world.
You've curated a beautiful life yourself. And 10 years from now, what might you regret if you didn't learn it or do it now?
So because I'm 68 and I don't know how long my wits are going to hold out, I feel that the one thing I know how to do is write. So I'm trying to write as much as possible. And because who knows what is going to happen next year or 3 years from now. And I've still got a lot that I want to share. But I have been basing some of my decisions on that very question. And for example, when my mother was going through the last seasons of her life, she had a stroke when she was 83, and then she lived to 90. And I'm her only child, and I was her only living relative. I realized that if I didn't spend as much time as possible, nearly all my time, with my mother, that's something I would regret forever. That was the non-negotiable first priority. And now I feel freed because I accompanied her to reaching 90 years old, and my kids are grown up and out in the world. And so, that's one of the ways in which getting older actually makes you feel happier and freer than ever before, because I feel I've discharged my responsibilities. So when I think about what I would regret, I think it mostly of what should I be doing now? And I think one of the beauties, we felt it all in the pandemic, because we were living so close to death. It made us think, how do we want to live? And getting older makes you think that too. And you faced it, I think, with more urgency than I. But, we don't know how much time we have. So what really calls us? And I suppose for me, it is the writing. I think my last book but one, almost the central sentence was, the fact nothing lasts is the reason that everything is important. And I love the fact that in older age, as during the pandemic, we're not taking anything for granted. As you and I were saying, we're taking walks in our neighborhood. We're looking out on a beautiful morning and say, let's make the most of this morning. We're thinking, we get the chance to talk to each other. This is what a great opportunity. Let's give our full bodies and hearts to it. So, but I love that question. I think it's one that I and most people would want to keep in our heads forever.
Well, it's my favorite MEA question, partly because anticipated regret, imagining a regret, is not something that you care about at age 20 so much, but you do care about it as you get older because time becomes so scarce. And I think that anticipated regret is a form of wisdom because it also brings the catalyst. It makes you have a quickening, that quickening of life to say like, you know what, seize the day, and this is something I need to do. And if the older you are, the maybe it shouldn't be 10 years. It's like 5 years. I asked my parents, who are both 87, in the next year, what would you regret if you didn't learn it or do it now? And it's a question that they ponder. And so, well, thank you for that.
And I think, sorry to interrupt you, but I think maybe you've also put your finger on why midlife is such a difficult time, because we've lost some of the freshness and energy and hopefulness of youth, but we haven't gained the urgency of being a little older. As you say, you and I in our 60s don't want to waste a minute. But when I was 47, I didn't have that sense of urgency. And yet I didn't have the sense of propulsion that I had when I was 19. And so you're in this kind of stagnant state easily, unless maybe that's the time to start remembering, I don't know how much longer I have. Let's embrace the moment and make the most of it.
How are you different than you were 20 years ago?
I think that's the main thing. So when I was 48, I wasn't thinking about the clock ticking in the same way. And I was the poorer for it.
So this will be in August 18th through the 23rd. Will be the second time you're coming to MEA in Santa Fe to teach. And just so for those who are listening and our growing audience, by the way, this podcast has become very popular. So, I'm enjoying this new medium. I should have done this long ago, but there are a lot of people who've never been to MEA who are listening to this and don't really understand it. And what's your perspective on it based upon what you've seen, as well as what you've seen in the online community conversations that have gone on? Do you have an observation that that is not coming out of my mouth, but it's coming out of yours?
Yes, and you said it a few minutes ago when you said this is why you created the MEA, to affect one person at a time. And I would say my definition of the MEA is intimacy and depth, an instant intimacy with people you might never otherwise meet or choose to meet. And as you know, I think I don't lead workshops. As a rule, I live in Japan. I'm happy at my desk. And before I was coming to visit the MEA last summer, both I and my wife had so many apprehensions. And within the first night, after the first night, when we went round in a circle and everybody shared very deeply what you don't know about me, suddenly I was propelled, so many of my defenses fell away. And suddenly I felt so close to 21 people I'd never met 6 hours before. And that deepened and intensified through the week. And my wife and I came away feeling that we had 21 friends that we knew at a very deep level and with whom we'd shared more perhaps than people we've known for 40 years, to such a point that my cohort, so the 25 people
called
in our group.
Picolicious. Your cohort is called Picolicious. Let's be clear.
Yeah, they dubbed it Picolicious. They still maintain a Zoom conversation every month, and my wife and I join it because we're so keen to find out where they are in their lives and to share where we are. We traveled to Boulder and met one friend. We had dinner with another member of our cohort here. It's really become a deep sense of community in ways I never could have anticipated. And I think, if I remember it correctly, as soon as I arrived at MEA, you and I had a 30-minute conversation. I said, Chip, I'm so glad you invited me to do this. But to be honest, I'm never going to be able to do it again. This is a once-in-a-lifetime thing. And I'm making an exception because you posed the invitation so attractively. By the end of that week, I said, Chip, can we do this again? And the funny thing is, just last week, I had the same experience, because I met my old friend Krista Tippett in Colorado, and she was on the way to the MEA, and she had some apprehensions. It's so different from what I usually do, and I'm quite a guarded person. I'm very introverted, and I don't know how I'm going to function. She wrote to me 4 days later after her last session. She said, I've already signed up for the next one. And I think it just has to do with making connections. And I sensed that the people coming there were clearly in search of wisdom, and they knew that we were all on a common journey and pilgrimage together. But it felt to me like the human connections we were making with a great treasure we were taking away. And I think because you've worked with Esalen and Burning Man and so many festivals around the world. You've drawn from all of those to see exactly how to dissolve people's defenses and reservations and bring us very quickly into a place of trust and deep community. And it's not something I've encountered anywhere else. I've been lucky enough to teach at Esalen and Tassajara and gained a lot from places like that. But this was a unique experience in terms of, as you said, I think, changing an individual one at a time. And so the midlife part almost becomes secondary, I think, to the sense of shared adventure. And we're all in this together. We're all entertaining the same questions. We may not come with answers, but the fact we're thinking about the same things and we're being prompted to come up with certain new habits and disciplines, like the one of anticipated regret. Or I loved, your telling me before I came, imagine writing an obituary for yourself. I mean, that's something that's really stayed with me. And the lists that you suggest that we make for our expectations or for the things that we would regret not having done, all those kind of practical exercises, it's hard to find anywhere else.
Well, there's Dacker Keltner, who's one of our faculty members, talks about awe. And I do believe that one of the magic pieces of MEA is the number 1 and number 2 most common pathways to awe in the world, which are interestingly not in nature. That's number 3. Number 1 is moral beauty, to witness compassion, kindness, equanimity, grit, tenacity, and the best humans have to offer. And then to feel that elevation of realizing I can do that too. And then secondly, collective effervescence, a term that comes from Émile Durkheim, the French sociologist, studying religious pilgrimages 115 years ago, in which he saw that in certain environments, people's sense of ego separation starts to dissolve and their sense of communal joy starts to emerge. And it is those two things, moral beauty and collective effervescence, that are really at the heart of an MEA experience and will be with you, because I love teaching with you. I feel that sense of elevation by being in your presence. So I just want to say thank you for that.
Well, I want to say, I don't want to turn this into mutual admiration society, and I don't want to embarrass you, and I'm not here to give an infomercial to MEA. But I think the third thing that you are probably too shy to mention is to see what you have chosen to give your life to in your 60s. So right after I was at the MEA last year, we were back here in Santa Barbara, and a member of our cohort lives nearby, so we all had dinner. He's in his 30s, and it's interesting, he's thinking about these midlife issues already. And he said, well, I saw Chip, and I know Chip hasn't always, he's had certain health challenges in recent times. I know he opened 52 hotels and been the wise elder for Airbnb. And it's so interesting and moving that, not knowing how many years he has, none of us knows that, he's chosen to give himself with so much energy to thinking about the purpose of life and the second half of life. And he said that made him rethink his life. And I think he'd worked in the tech community, and he decided he wanted to be a coach to try to help people. So I think just the model of thinking this is the important thing we should be thinking about. I think many of us get caught up in the resume treadmill and forget about the eulogy till it's too late. And just by redirecting our minds towards that, I think the MEA is helping to clarify our priorities. And as you said, anticipate the things that we might regret. Nobody, famously, it's always said on the deathbed, nobody says, I wish I'd worked more.
Last question. Someone comes to you who's, I don't know, maybe in their 30s and says, I want to do some tea with you in Kyoto next week. I would love to tap into your wisdom. Could you come to the tea, our little tea affair here, and just give me one little bumper sticker of wisdom that you've learned, and how did you learn that? What was the origin story of that piece of wisdom?
Life has better plans for you than you have for life. And the origin story is I've learned it the hard way, as all of us do, again and again through my life. Because like most of us in my 20s, I had all kinds of plans. I mapped out my future. I knew exactly what I wanted to do. And I was sure that life would allow me to do it. And again, surprises, good and bad, have come my way. And I realized that I'm not master of my destiny, and that circumstances, whatever it is in the universe, is determining my life much more than I am. And to some extent, I'm in the passenger seat rather than the driver's seat. And that's scary because sometimes I'm in the passenger seat in a car in India. You know those cars well, and they're driving at 90 miles an hour and there are no red lights, and you don't know if you're going to survive. But that act of trust and the sense that that what life is going to do to you is going to speak for a higher logic than the rational logic that you could access. So whether it's I haven't said yet that when I moved to from New York to Japan, I went to live in a little temple in Kyoto, Japan, and I actually had a book contract to write about a year of a foreigner living in a temple in Japan. And my third week in Japan, I went into another temple and I sat next to a woman. And fell in love, and that was the end of my year in the temple, and the beginning of a very different year. And then that woman, whom you know, my wife Hiroko, had 2 kids. So suddenly, as a writer who loves being alone, I was thrown into a family in a 2-room apartment with 2 adolescent kids in a foreign country, and I had to learn all kinds of things I never would have learned otherwise. And then my house burnt down, but suddenly I realized I don't have any notes. Now I can write fiction instead. And again, just a torrent of things happen, good and bad. And I realized my job in life, and I think most of us, it's the case, is to kind of follow the prompts of life rather than to imagine that we know more than life does. So that's a long answer to the poor person who requested a tea in Kyoto. But the first sentence is the bumper sticker.
Thank you. You're amazing. I love you. And look forward to seeing you in August in Santa Fe. Thanks for joining the Midlife Chrysalis.
I'm so looking forward to this. And thank you for all you do, Chip, in the MEA and in your books and right here. Thank you. I can't wait to see you about 5 weeks from now.
Well, wasn't that a delicious conversation? I always come away from hanging out with my Pico friend feeling that Pico-licious that we talked about, this idea of life is delicious when you're hanging out with Pico. 3 key things I learned from that conversation. Number 1 is the idea that home is not the soil, it's the soul. Something he said, and I just, I love aphorisms, and that's one that I can remember. It's not about where you're living, it's about how you're living and how you're embodying living in yourself. And that brings me to the second learning I had, which is really this idea of stillness and this inner savings account. We need to, replenish ourselves, fuel ourselves with whether it's meditation or being in nature or going out and doing things that fuel you on a soulful level, not necessarily accumulating knowledge, but learning how to invest in your soul. And that's a really important piece of being able to have the resilience. Pico and I are teaching August 18th through the 23rd, basically a workshop on how to be resilient in the chaotic times we live in. So that's a big piece of what I heard. I loved the idea of, the Dalai Lama as his modern elder. I had never heard as much of the Dalai Lama's story as he told today, and how much he has been by that man's side. And the Dalai Lama has cited that Pico is one of the people in the world he has the closest relationship with. And yet there are lots of people who write books with the Dalai Lama. Pico's not one of them. Pico's one of those people who's sort of the quiet person on the side who's listening and observing from the Dalai Lama. And I think he'll talk quite a bit about that in the workshop. I do have one last thing. And he said, books will be forgotten, but acts of kindness will be remembered. It reminds me of a little bit of Maya Angelou, which is about, it's not what people, people will not remember what you said or what you did. They'll remember how you made them feel. And Pico is one of those people in the world who always makes people feel as if they are the most important person in his life. And I think he learned that from the Dalai Lama. So hope you enjoyed that episode. Look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks for listening to the Midlife Chrysalis. This show is produced by Midlife Media. If you enjoyed this episode, help us spread the word by subscribing and leaving a review on your favorite platform.